Well, some people were commenting on the two-barrel carburetor and the 455 cubic inch V8. And actually, during the 60s and even into the early 70s, the usage of a two-barrel carburetor was relatively common in the GM and Ford lineups. And it really was not used on Chevrolets or on Cadillacs. There were no two barrels on big block engines for either Chevrolet or Cadillac. Buick also didn't use two-barrel carburetors on its big block motors, but Olds and Pontiac did, and I guess that's a bit of a misnomer on the Pontiac. There's not really a Pontiac big block or small block in the 60s and early 70s era. All Pontiac V8s are the same physical size from that era. But Oldsmobile and Pontiac did use two-barrel carburetors on their 455 cubic inch V8s, and Ford also used two-barrel carburetors on their 429 cubic inch V8s. And it sounds pretty piddly and that it wouldn't work well, but owning a number of these, I can tell you it works just fine. And often the vehicles feel more responsive at lower RPM with the two-barrel carburetor than they do with the four barrels. So here's a graph from 1968 for the Oldsmobile 455 cubic inch engines, both the horsepower and torque graphs. So the higher lines on the chart are generally related to horsepower, and then the other lines are related to torque. So you can see in the chart that you have a number of the 455 cubic inch power curves, including the Tornado, which would be the top dashed line. That would be the horsepower, which tops out over the chart at 400 horsepower. The torque line for that's also the dashed line. You can see the torque peak at about 3,600 RPMs, and the horsepower peak is around 5,000 RPM, so relatively high revving. Now contrast that with the 320 horsepower Rocket 455 two-barrel, which is a solid black line making 320 horsepower at around 4,200 RPMs, and its torque peak comes in a little south of 2,400 RPMs, whereas the four-barrel carbureted V8s, the torque peak comes in at around 3,000 RPMs, about 600 RPMs higher than the two-barrel carburetors. You can also see in some cases that below 2,400 RPMs that the two-barrel carbureted engines are making more horsepower. So long story short, the two-barrel carburetors are actually quite wonderful if you're just driving around town, and so long as you're not passing somebody at 70 miles an hour on the freeway, they often feel peppier and deliver great performance as well as simplicity of service. And to be honest, I think it was that simplicity of service that, in particular for Ford, they seem to use a lot of two-barrel carburetors, whether it's on their big block 429 or on other engines like their 400. I think because the Autolite 2100 two-barrel was just such a great carburetor, and sadly the 4300 carburetor that came out in 1967 was really just a bad four-barrel carburetor. I own a lot of them, and to be honest, even from the factory, they're not great. I make special modifications to them so that the cars run better with them, but I've put a couple Edelbrocks, or a couple cars that I bought have come with Edelbrocks on them, and I honestly have not swapped the original carburetor back from the Edelbrock that's on there, just because I believe the Edelbrock has a lot more responsiveness and performance. And that's just because the four-barrel was tuned to be a emissions carburetor from the start. And the Autolite 2100 had been around for a long time and was very reliable, super simple. So one reason why I think the two barrels were especially popular on the Fords, and on the GMs, the Quadrajets were quite reliable, but the two-barrel Rochester 2GCs were also very simple and reliable. And Chrysler really never used the two barrels on their largest engines like the 440. They did have them on 383s and on 400 cubic inch engines, but on the 440, the biggest motor, they never really had a two-barrel, whereas, as I said, the Olds and Pontiac 455s both had two barrels at one point in their useful life. And for the AMC fans out there, the largest AMC made V8, the 401 cubic inch motor, never had a 2-barrel either. Their 360 did, and of course their 304 and the smaller V8s. But the largest engine, the 401, did not. And AMC also used Ford Motorcraft carburetors in the late 60s, early 70s, well, throughout the remainder of the years that their V8 was produced, for better or worse. So when they were using the 2-barrel Motorcraft, that was a good thing. When they were using the 4-barrel Motorcraft, well, maybe they would have done better. In any case, here's a similar graph for the 1971 model year for Oldsmobile, which by that time, Oldsmobile engines had gone from being high compression to low compression, just like all other General Motors vehicles, because they had to run on no lead or low lead gasoline, which was a GM corporate edict. It took Ford another year to switch over, but GM did it a bit early with the 1971 model year. And you can see here that for this 455 2-barrel that was standard in the Delta Custom, the Delta 88 Royale, and the Custom Cruiser, that the gross horsepower is around 280. The net horsepower is 185, or about 2/3 of the gross horsepower rating. And the net horsepower is done with all the accessories on the engine and the exhaust system. The gross horsepower is basically just measured with the engine out of the car on its own, no air cleaner, nothing else. But by this year, you can also tell that some of the horsepower and torque peaks had moved down in the RPM range, while the previous versions had peak horsepower north of 4,000 RPM. You notice the gross horsepower rating here on this 455 2-barrel peaks at about 3,800 RPM, and the torque peak is down in the 2,000-ish RPM range. So as the years went on, particularly as emissions became more and more of a concern, the horsepower and torque peaks start moving down in the RPM range as the automakers had to do various things to try to get the emission controls and the overall emissions of the motors to be reduced, meaning more restrictive cylinder heads to promote more combustion swirl, as well as more restrictive exhaust systems with catalytic converters and things like that. But you can see here in 1971, those horsepower and torque peaks are already moving down, and Oldsmobile continued this 455 2-barrel option, as did Pontiac in the 1971 model year. And for Oldsmobile, it was gone by the 1972 model year. You either had a 4-barrel 455, a 352 barrel, or a 354 barrel in the full-size cars. Hope you enjoyed this explanation of big block engines with 2-barrel carburetors. Thanks for watching. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Please feel free to send me an email or write in the comments section to let me know if you like these type of technical videos, and also like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching. Happy holidays and New Year.